the context of the phrase is usually not brought up alongside it. And so usually when I've heard this phrase used or even preached on, the idea is, well, look around you, look at the world around you and see that the fields are already white for harvest, that the world is ready to receive the gospel, to hear the gospel, and to be preached to, and to be converted. And there is some truth to that in general, but Jesus doesn't say this without saying anything else first. In fact, there's a whole story that goes along with this that we're going to take a look at least briefly. And we're going to get a better idea of the context and a little bit better idea of what Jesus means when he uses this phrase. That the fields are in fact white for harvest, but there are some qualifiers for that. We'll take a look at that as we go through. And the first place that we're going to look, like we said, is at the context. And what we're going to do is we're going to back our way up through chapter 4. And so, like I said, we're looking at verse 35 here, and Jesus makes this statement that the fields are white for harvest, that is, that people are ready to receive the gospel. But before that point, what do we see? And so in the section right before this, in verses 31 and following, there's a question that's asked of Jesus after his disciples return, and they want to know how he has gotten something to eat. And so they have this discussion between the physical and the spiritual. Jesus says that I already have food that you don't know about. And they say, well, how did he get food? Well, that doesn't really make sense. We didn't bring him any food, so who brought him food? And of course, Jesus speaks spiritually. The disciples think physically, as happens pretty often. And so with Jesus' statement there's that division between physical and spiritual. But let's back up a little bit more. In verses 27 down through about verse 30, this is when his disciples arrived back in the first place. And when they come back to Jesus, they marvel at him. It says that he talked with a woman. Okay, well, put ourselves back in that cultural context, and women have a lesser place in society. There's really no other way to put it. And especially, not only is she a woman, but in the region that they are in, she is a Samaritan woman. And there's an issue there as well between the Jews and the Samaritans, which we'll mention a little bit farther along. So they are shocked to see him speaking to this woman. But of course, that means that the context before this point is the conversation that Jesus is having with this Samaritan woman. And so what exactly happens there? Well, hopefully you know the story already. If you don't, we'll tell it very briefly. Jesus is at a well, and he asks his disciples to find some food. And by this well, we don't know if there are other people around. Presumably there probably are, but there's at least this other woman there who is a woman of Samaria, as she's described in verse 7. And he asks her to give him a drink. Okay? And from there, the conversation turns to the spiritual. And Jesus says, I can offer you something better than water. I can offer you a spiritual, a living water. He refers to himself or to the gospel or whatever way you want to understand that best. And she desires this water. After Jesus explains a little bit more about it, though, in verse 15, the woman says, Sir, give me this water, that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw. Jesus responds, though, in verse 16, knowing her thoughts, and says, Go call your husband and come here. And the woman says, I have no husband. And then, of course, Jesus tells her, okay, sure enough, you don't have a husband, but you're actually living with someone, and you've been married 5 times. And so while it's true that you don't have a husband, that's not quite the full story. Jesus reveals that. Beyond that, after that happens in verse 19, the woman says, oh, you must be a prophet. And Jesus says, well, okay, sure, but the woman says, I want to know something from you. And the woman asks a question. She asks, well, is it better to worship here at this mountain, as in Mount Gerizim specifically, which we'll talk about, or is it proper to worship at Jerusalem because that's what the Jews say? And so she asks this spiritual question of Jesus, recognizing him as a spiritual prophet. And Jesus will respond to her saying, you know what, soon enough, it's not going to matter one place or the other. And so it doesn't matter if you worship on a mountain, it doesn't matter if you worship in Jerusalem, it'll all be the same. And so he tells her what true worship is really about. But with all of this, what we're looking for is the general context of the statement that Jesus is making here. So Jesus makes the statement, the fields are white for harvest, and he does that, but he doesn't do it without prompting. And so there is this whole conversation that leads up to this statement that's made. And so when Jesus tells his disciples, look, the fields are ready to be harvested, what fields would he be referring to? Would it not be the ones that he's just been at? What we're saying is the context places Jesus' statement here not as a general statement of, everywhere people are ready to receive the gospel. Instead, Jesus says, right here, in this place where I have just been, with this individual in particular that I have just spoken with, right here the gospel is ready to be preached. Now, he may mean Samaria in a larger sense, but he certainly also means this individual with whom he has just spoken. And so what we're going to do for the next few minutes is we're going to take a look at this woman and see what we can learn about her, and in particular, what makes her different than someone else. What makes her ready to receive the gospel when maybe somebody else would not be. Jesus says the fields are white for harvest. He says it in this particular meaning here of this particular woman. Okay, great. So why is this woman ready? Okay, so with that in mind, what does make this woman different? Well, we have to start with her background. So she is, in fact, a Samaritan. Now, what is a Samaritan? So in simple terms, Samaritans are the byproduct of the people left over whenever the 10 northern tribes of Israel were taken into Assyrian captivity. And so the people that were left in the land largely intermarried with the native Canaanites that were still left in the land that were never driven out like they were supposed to be when the land was initially conquered. And so they end up being partially Jewish and partially Canaanite. And so this ethnic group becomes known as the Samaritans. So is that the only difference ethnically? Well, no. In fact, they developed during that time, and it continues to progress, and in fact, it still exists today. They developed the religion of Samaritanism. Now, Samaritanism is largely Jewish. It's quite similar to the Jewish faith, but there are some differences. So most importantly, the one that's pointed out in this text is the place of worship. And so the woman asked the question. And it was true at that time, it's still true today, that if you are a Samaritan, religiously speaking, you would worship at Mount Gerizim, because that's the place that they think is the holy place that God should be worshipped. There's a couple of reasons for that. You can look back in the Old Testament to whenever they first enter into the Promised Land. Mount Gerizim is actually one of the first places that they go to, the Jews go to. And at that time, God pronounces blessings from Mount Gerizim, curses from Mount Ebal. There's that whole situation. So that's one part of it. The other side of it is that Jews traditionally say that Mount Zion, where Jerusalem is located, is the exact mountain where Abraham almost sacrificed his son Isaac. Okay? Well, that is a different telling of the story than the Samaritan telling. Because in their telling of the story, it was Mount Gerizim. Now, in reality, we're not told either way where it happened, but they say that Isaac was almost sacrificed on Mount Gerizim, making it a significant place for them. Now, the other major difference, the other big difference between the Jews and the Samaritans is that the Samaritans only follow the Torah. They only follow the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And so they don't listen to the prophets, they don't pay any attention to the writings, to anything else, except those first 5 books. So they do follow the Jewish law, but only that part of the Jewish law, the actual law itself. And so that's going to be quite a bit different as well. So she knows the law, this woman does, even if she doesn't know the prophets, but that still gives Jesus a starting point. And she even asked a spiritual question, and so Jesus is able to guide her properly there. But given that background, it makes a little more sense why Jesus would say, you know what? You're asking a question about the difference between the Jews and the Samaritans. Tell you what, in just a little while, it's not going to matter one way or the other, whether you're Jewish or whether you're Samaritan, because God will be worshipped in true worship, not just in these particular places. The second thing we can point out, though, about this particular woman and what makes her more ready to receive the gospel message is that she is willing to have a conversation. Now that sounds pretty simple, but if we're going to compare her to the situation that we see around us in the world. If we go out and we're trying to teach somebody about Christ, how many people right off the bat are willing to talk about it? And so this woman, as simple as it sounds, she was willing to have the conversation. And that by itself is worth pointing out, because today, without previously knowing the individual, it's going to be pretty hard to talk to somebody about this particular topic. And even if it is brought up, they may claim to be too busy, or they may claim that they are informed enough about religion. They don't really need to know whatever it is that we're going to tell them. And so imagine the difference for this woman. What if Christ himself, God in the flesh, had come to her and had said, I can offer you living water. And she said, actually, I'm kind of busy. I've really got to get to this other thing that I've got going on, so maybe call back some other day. And so today we do struggle a little bit more against that problem of busyness. We'll mention that again in just a few minutes, but we do struggle with that. But if people are willing to have a conversation, that does make a difference. The third thing we'll point to is that she has an interest in improving her life. Now, everybody has an interest in improving their life, but she has an honest interest in it. In verse 15 of John chapter 4, the woman says, Sir, give me this water that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw. Now, I have never lived in a time without the ability to do laundry by mechanized electronic machines that take care of the whole process for me. Now, some of you are old enough that you did laundry without those. And if you did, how much longer does it take to do laundry by hand than to do laundry in a washing machine and with a dryer? This woman is interested in relieving just a little bit of the burden of the work that she has to do. Now, it might sound like laziness, but imagine all the things that are necessary without the modern conveniences that we have. She's saying, if I could not come here to draw water, who knows how far it was for her to do that every day, maybe multiple times a day. And so she says, boy, if I could not do that, my life would be a little bit better. Now today, the comparison then that we want to make in reaching out to people is that there are plenty of people who are satisfied with how their life is. Even if by any outward appearance their life is not great, whether spiritually or even in material terms, their life may not be the best, and yet they say, it's all right, and I don't really care if I can improve it or not. But this woman has an interest in making her life better. The third thing, whenever Jesus brings up this idea in verse 17 of her husband, and she says, I have no husband, why does she say that? And there are probably different reasons we could suggest, but it seems like she's embarrassed just a little bit to tell the whole story. Say, well, you asked for my husband, which of the 5 ex-husbands do you mean? Or do you mean the person I'm living with now? She doesn't volunteer that information. And so it seems that at some level she is embarrassed by, has some sort of guilt about or shame about her past sin. Well, that's good. If you want to reach somebody with the gospel, that's a pretty good starting point. And again, if we compare that to today, how does it compare? Do we find people who are embarrassed by sin, or do we find people who are proud to be living the sin that they're in? And too often that's the case. Even in her situation, we find people happily living together, unmarried, not in accordance with what God says, and they're okay with that. And more than that, they're happy about it. So she's embarrassed by sin. In verse 19, she says, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. So one other thing we might say about her is that when she hears the truth, she recognizes it. And she believes it even to an extent. She could easily hear Jesus' words and say, okay, that's kind of interesting that he guessed that, but I can probably explain it some other way. But instead she says, okay, yeah, this guy, he knows something. And he knows the truth about me. And maybe that means he knows the truth about other things. And of course, she is right. Jesus is a prophet. He's more than a prophet, but he's at least that. And so she recognizes that. She has a mind that's open enough to recognize that. We again, applying this more directly to ourselves, we would look at people that we could talk to today, and for ourselves, we recognize the Word of God as being the truth that it is. And we see how easy it is to look at it and say, you know what, this is the truth. This doesn't read as a fable. This doesn't read as something that man has made up. This reads as what God has intended for humanity to learn from Him. Well, that's a difference. But we recognize that, and we recognize the truth when we read it. And we wish that others would as well. But there's sometimes this barrier. But in this case, the woman was sincere enough that that barrier was removed. She also is interested in that she shows questions, or she asks questions. She shows her interest by the questions that she asks. So she asked one direct question of Jesus. In verse 12, she says, "Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well?" And so that question may be a little bit leading even, but it is a genuine question. She says, "Are you greater than him?" The answer, of course, is yes, he is. But she asked that question of Jesus. In verse 20 and 25, it's not quite a question, but it allows Jesus the opportunity to respond. Again, she's having a conversation. She says in verse 20, "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that Jerusalem is the place you ought to worship." And then she allows Jesus to respond. Again, in verse 25, she says, "I know that Messiah is coming," who is called Christ. "When he comes, he will tell us all things." And then allows Jesus the opportunity to speak to her and to say, "I who speak to you am he." And so she allows that opportunity. She asks the questions for sincere understanding. That by itself allows her to be someone who is more ready for harvest or ripe for harvest than somebody else would be. And the one other thing we'll say about her, and we haven't covered this part of the story, but in verses 39 and following, this woman, after she has encountered Jesus, is willing to tell others about him. And so that by itself makes her, or is a good sign that she is someone who's ready to receive the gospel, to receive the truth. Because she's not only willing to hear it herself, but willing to share it with others. So she has changed not just the course of her own life by being willing, by being open-minded, but she's also changed the course of the history of this town that she lives in, and maybe the area at large as well. And so a difference in attitude can certainly change a lot, even in a local area. And so the question then is this: who is ready for harvest? And there are these indicators that we can look at and say, well, if I were to look at somebody and ask this question, maybe I can tell based on these things. Of course, you can't tell just by looking. And so what do we see about this? What applications do we make from this? Let's start with this. In Matthew chapter 10, in verses 11 and following there, again, Matthew 10, starting verse 11, Jesus, after his disciples, or before his disciples are being sent out on their own, he tells them that whenever they go out, that they should go into all the towns and the villages that they pass through, and they should stay there, unless the people there are not willing to receive them. If they're not willing to receive them, okay, then obviously you don't stay, and Jesus tells them to kick the dust from their feet and to leave. And so it's kind of equivalent to washing their hands of that place. And so the question then for us is, if Jesus says on the one hand that the fields are white for harvest, and they're ready, and you should go out into the fields, and you should be preaching, you should be teaching. And then on the other hand, he says, but sometimes you're supposed to kick the dust off your feet, and you're supposed to leave them alone because there's better things you could do and more people you could reach. Then how do we know when that's going to be? How do we know which to do? Do we stay and teach, or do we leave? And probably too much of the time we leave that up in the air, and we end up teaching to brick walls where we won't make progress, and we leave unturned people that are ready to hear the gospel. So how do we know the difference? How can we distinguish between those who are ready, those who are not? Another analogy we might take from Christ is in the parable of the sower. How would we know if somebody's heart is made of good soil or if it's stony soil, or the soil has been so compacted that the seed can't get into it? And so we ask this question again. And the quick answer is you won't know until you try. And you won't know until you try. As we said, you can't tell just by looking at somebody that they will or will not receive the gospel. It's just not possible. And so somebody may look nicely dressed, they may look well put together, and they may have a heart of stone that has no interest in the gospel whatsoever. And somebody may look pretty rough, and they may even act pretty rough, and yet they're the one that's going to be willing and receptive to the gospel message. And so we can't tell just by looking at someone. If the example of the soil is what we're going for, then you would have to say that you'd have to turn up a little dirt before you would know whether or not that soil is going to be any good. But that being said, generally you're going to be able to tell pretty quickly whether somebody has any interest or has any of these kind of qualities that we're looking for in somebody that would be receptive to the gospel. And so we can go through this list and we can say, well, do they have any religious background? Maybe, maybe not. If they don't, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but oftentimes it can be a good thing to have a religious background. Are they willing to have the conversation? If you try to ask them anything about their life or their history with churches or with God in general, and they say, I'm not interested, I don't want to talk about it, goodbye, that probably tells you all you need to know. That doesn't mean you have to give up entirely, but it means it's probably not going to happen today. Do they have any interest in improving their lives? Are they embarrassed by sin in their life? Or are they, when you bring up sin in their life, are they ready to point out that they can do what they want and that they are not open to judgment? And so we can go through the whole list and ask all of these questions, but those are the general ideas that we can go with. The other thing we might say, though, as far as making sure that every person is preached to, because we can't tell just by looking, in the later part of this text, in verse 37, and this is part of the text that was read for us initially, it says, "For in this the saying is true, that one sows and another reaps." Another reason that we have the responsibility to preach to people, even if it doesn't seem like they're going to be receptive, is because we might not be the one that is the person that harvests that eventual soul. And so it may be that all we can do is plant the seed there. And it may be years until anything happens with it. And it may not be us who ever has any contact with that person again, but one person may sow and another person may reap. And of course, ultimately, it's not for our benefit that we do this. And we're not trying to gain numbers for ourselves individually, but rather for God. So why is it then that when Jesus says that the world is ripe for harvest, why is it that not everybody in the world is ready to immediately respond? Now, on the one hand, we could look at this logically and take this analogy and apply it logically. Now, we could say, well, is that true just in the United States? Is it true that every crop that's planted is ready for harvest on the same day? It's not even close. Even the same crop, even if it's just soybeans or if it's just wheat that we're talking about, is that always ready to harvest the same day? Well, no. Because it might not have been planted the same day, because it's in different climates from north to south across the U.S. And so we would look at this and say, well, is the world going to be ready all at once for every soul to respond to God's message? No, but we can look for those that are. We can look for people like the Samaritan woman, ones that are willing and recipient. But today, that's not really what we find a lot of times. And this is not to be negative in general, because there are people who are willing to receive the message, but those who aren't, what is the difference? What is it about them? We'll say three things about them real quick. One, they're busy. Now, that's kind of a misleading idea that somebody's busy, because what is busyness? Busyness is a symptom of bad priorities and or bad time management. And so people are either really bad at saying no to things maybe, or they just prioritize things that aren't all that important and they say that they are busy. Well, if you're busy, then you're too busy, that is, for a message that could save your soul, then you're going to end up in reality prioritizing the day-to-day life more than the eternal life. And that's what that is. And it's unfortunate that happens, but it does happen. In A second idea there is that there are people who are just worldly. Now, that's no surprise to us, but there are people who love the things of the world. Okay? What's the problem there? The problem is that it is harder to convert someone to Christ when you first have to convert them away from the world. And so you can convert someone to Christ, but if you have to convert them away from an addiction first, how much harder is that going to be? If you have to convert someone to Christ, but first you have to turn them away from their love of money, how much harder is that? And so it's a two-step conversion rather than just the one. That doesn't mean it's not worth it. Doesn't mean it's not possible, but it is harder. And it's harder even still for those who are without God. It's harder to turn someone away from addiction. It's harder to turn someone away from money if they don't have the foundation, the moral foundation of God in the first place. And of course, a lot of people are, in fact, closed-minded. And so they may be closed-minded, rejecting the truth because they think that they already have the truth. In fact, we could point to the Samaritan woman to say that, at least as far as she thought she had the truth before. But when she heard what real truth sounded like, she was willing to accept it. And so people today, it's probably not Samaritanism. You're probably not going to run into many Samaritans today. But you might run into somebody that believes strongly in the existence of humanity solely by the means of evolution. And they may be pretty set in that point. And if they are, it's going to be pretty hard to convince them otherwise. It may be that they are guided only by their feelings. It may be that they are guided by some other societal or even environmental movement that dictates their morals rather than God. But in all those cases, God has been replaced to an extent by whatever it is that has closed their mind off. And so what do we do with all of this? Just to wrap this up, we say, one, we as Christians have a duty and a responsibility to teach all people. But we also have a duty and a responsibility to teach those who will accept and to make sure that we can identify, to recognize those who are more likely to accept. Now again, we preach to everyone, but when we start to preach and we start to teach and we see, oh, that person's not just hearing the words, that person's actually being changed, that person's actually showing interest, they're asking questions. And obviously that's where the energy would be put. And so Jesus spends a little bit of time talking to this woman. And in doing so, he doesn't just change the future for this one individual, but even for her family and for the town that she's from. And so one change can result in a much bigger ripple effect, of course, than just one person. But this morning, if you aren't a Christian, if you have not been added to the church, if you've never believed in God at all, this is a chance to change, or at least this is a chance to be open-minded, to be willing to listen, to be willing to ask questions. And if you have any of those, we'd love to answer them. It's an opportunity to recognize truth when it's spoken, not because this individual up here spoke that, but because it comes from the Word of God. And this morning, if you are a Christian, that's even better, but that also means that this applies all the more for you, because this is the reminder to us that the field is ripe for harvest. Maybe not every field is going to produce equal results, but there are people who are out there who are waiting to hear the message. And until we try, we won't know who will be willing to respond. But this morning, if you're willing to respond, if you're willing to come forward now as we stand and sing, if you have any need, come now as we stand.
Come to Jesus, he will save you, though your sins as crimson flow. If you give your heart to Jesus, he will make it white as snow. Come to Jesus, come to Jesus, come King.